Thank you very much, Susan. And away we go. You know, this whole idea of prioritization is part and parcel of sort of that unsexy front end to a lot of work. Whether you're doing projects or if you think of things as products, it really doesn't matter. You have to know, you really have to know what the right stuff is and when to do that, right? So knowing what work to do and in what order is just basically, well, it's critical, right, to delivering the right value. Screwing it up, messing it up, messing up, or just, any type of wrecking of prioritization is really, unfortunately, fairly easy to do. And unfortunately, not very uncommon. I see a lot of people working on stuff, and I'll use that great technical term there, stuff. Is it the right stuff? Is it the important things? Oftentimes it's the urgent, but not necessarily the important. So let's try to avoid all of that stuff. But to do that, I think we first have to understand a couple of definitions, and then we can dive into some different patterns of doing this. All right, so let's start with a couple of quick definitions. Work entry is one of my great passions. Matter of fact, last year I did one of these sessions called, for work entry, no agile for you. And I really mean that to be very true. So it's really boils down to how work comes to the team. And so work comes, whether it comes to the organization, whether it comes to, as Jeremy Willits puts it, the mushy middle, or whether it comes to the team, how that happens is really an important process. Because once you get it, you can then start to wrestle with prioritization. And prioritization is a why question. Why are we doing it? Why is it a why question? And no pun intended, or at least no alliteration intended. It really boils down to it. Is this valuable? What's more valuable? What's less valuable? That's what prioritization is all about. Sequencing, which is sort of a close cousin to prioritization, and in a lot of cases probably ought to be just about the same, rarely is, unfortunately, is what order we do things in. And that's where we add all of that other context, technology, capabilities, people. That'll help us to determine what order we do it. Here's what's important. Here's the order to do it. Why does this matter? I mean, this matters. The whole idea of prioritization matters for a ton of reasons. And it matters both at a team level, which many of us wrestle with, right? But it also matters at the organization level. And this is not an esoteric decision, right? In discussion, because very frankly, undisciplined prioritization, because you always are doing prioritization, has many effects. And I'm not going to belabor all of these, but let's face it, you prioritize things badly, you will probably end up interrupting things. Disrupted work causes all sorts of waste in terms of picking it up, putting it down. We'll explore that a little later on in more detail, but it's a big deal, right? It reduces trust. And very frankly, that might actually be the most important effect of the whole idea of bad prioritization. And obviously, it creates technical debt. All of that on the team side. At the organizational level, it can cause turnover. It causes friction. It causes people to not feel good about what they're doing. And very frankly, in this market, people go elsewhere. And in the long run, it reduces innovation. I would suggest that both teams and organizations have to obsess about prioritization. I don't think this is Pollyannish, right? This isn't this isn't about just doing stuff on the backlog. You must do things on the backlog. It's about doing what's important. And what's important has to get to a point where it trumps and moves up the list the things that are perhaps just urgent and not that important. So I'd like to suggest that there are 5 scenarios where prioritization goes wrong. These 5 scenarios are really just buckets because there are some subsections in here, but it starts with timing. And that includes, the cadences, really setting aside time, things like that, falling prey to the tyranny of the urgent kinds of stuff, risk tolerance mismatches. It's funny, but everyone has different tolerances. And most organizations, when they wrestle with prioritization, they use things like crowdsourcing to make that go away. But in reality, it doesn't get dealt with quite directly because nobody necessarily recognizes it. Prioritization outside of your span of control. And even if you're the CEO of an organization, there are things that are truly outside of your span of control, or at least should be outside of your span of control. We'll explore those. Doing it badly, and just from the basic logistics of blocking and tackling, poor processes, right? And there are a number of different ways to do that. I mean, very frankly, we find a lot of times people have this silver bullet kind of algorithm for prioritization. It's a formula, or they're just going to blanket use things like weighted shortest job first. And very frankly, that isn't the correct answer. There's probably a myriad of ways, but we have to understand what the approach is and make sure that it has transparency and things like that. And then finally, no control over work entry. And very frankly, if you have no control over work entry, prioritization is, at least formal prioritization, is pretty much a moot point, right? Stuff comes in, and he or she that yells the loudest is going to get what they want, right? So all in. Let's start with the first category, timing, and spend some time there. That was intended, by the way. Timing. Let's face it. At a strategic level, if we take that top level of the organization, prioritization takes a lot of time and effort. That ends up being, people, think about this, and they do it as events. I've even seen prioritization as off-site events where people fly places. That's, back when people flew around a lot, but they would go places and they would spend all sorts of time and effort. They would have PowerPoints that were, 100 slides long. It was just an event, which means they did it very infrequently, maybe quarterly, maybe annually. If they were really lucky, it might be every 90 days, something along those lines. But the real world is a lot more dynamic than that, right? Just because you're prioritizing on a semi-annual or annual basis doesn't mean that the world only changes when, once or twice a year kind of thing. So let's explore some of the way poor timing impacts prioritization and how we can deal with that. So the first is a scenario where you have too long of a planning horizons. The first sort of problem that crops up is that because you have these too long of planning items, people find things that become urgent. I like to call this my hair is on fire effect, right? So something comes up, they get they get fired up. You know, gotta happen, gotta happen, gotta happen. Lots of hand waving kind of stuff. Importance should always trump urgency. And that's obviously easily said, rarely done. But there are simple ways. There are simple ways to do that. And one of the simplest ones that I think we all probably have run into is the classic Eisenhower box. Probably know it as urgency and importance, but it goes all the way back to one of the presidents in the late 50s, right? Dwight David Eisenhower, who used this approach, and that's why it's called the Eisenhower box, used this approach to sort things out so that the things that were important and urgent were the ones that got focused on. Then you could focus on the important things that weren't urgent, and then we could deal with those other things perhaps if there's time. And I'll be honest with you, there almost never is time. We have things, laundry lists of to-do lists that very frankly are longer than can ever get done. Therefore, having a way of at least starting to sort through and getting to what's important is a good part. So think about things. It doesn't have to be, it doesn't have to be real high tech. The Eisenhower box, the urgency importance matrix is an easy approach to having that discussion. Too long a planning horizon causes other kinds of problems. One of the worst problems that I see when you have too long of a planning horizon, very much akin to my hair's on fire, is queue jumping. And queue jumping is perhaps perhaps one of the worst problems that I see in organization. Steve Tendon, a friend of mine, wrote a book on productivity and his approach to that. And very frankly, he goes through the idea of queue jumping. Queue jumping starts with a lot of fear that my stuff isn't going to get dealt with, but it generates action that just messes up all of the plans around it because I'm down the priority list, but I really want this. And I'm afraid that if I don't get this, my job perhaps is at risk. I'm going to try to jump the queue. I'm going to try to get ahead and get over the bar. I watch a lot of probably bad science fiction movies. And almost always in these post-apocalyptic or apocalyptic kind of movies, people are queuing up to get away. And everybody's trying to jump the queue and there's mayhem. That's the same problem that we're seeing with queue jumping. Because again, our time, we have a too long of a planning horizon. Therefore, people get afraid they're going to be left behind. Jumping the queue happens. It's a leadership problem, unfortunately, right? And in many organizations, jumping the queue, getting it done, saving the day is recognized as being a wonderful thing. To be honest with you, I think leadership has to have a pretty black and white approach to queue jumping. The word no has to be in their vocabulary. The the phrase "get to the back of the line" might be, or perhaps management ought to invest in some tasers and push back. But let's face it, time being too long isn't always the only problem, right? Um, uh, Again, organizations have many layers in them. But if we simplify this and we think about there's a layer at the top that deals with strategic prioritization. It's almost like the three bears, right? But that idea that top level deals with strategic, and that tends to be a slow, long-term kind of grind, right? We prioritize once a year, we fly away, we do it, we do all these big studies. At a team level, all the way down at the bottom, we're dealing with tactical things. We're prioritizing every day. Frankly, if you're doing Scrum or Kanban and you're doing a daily stand-up meeting, that's a daily planning, a daily prioritization meeting. So we're doing this at a very fast rate. We have slow at the top, really fast at the bottom. We have different planning horizons. Things tend to build up a lot of friction. That, as Jeremy Willits calls it, mushy middle, right? Jeremy and I are writing a book on work entry, and so we collaborate a lot. But he came up with this idea of the mushy middle, which is that middle management layer. Directors, managers, those things, they act as the transmission between the big engine up here of strategy and the day-to-day activity of actually making stuff happen. They have to be that, they have to layer in that syncing. In many of the agile techniques, we think of that as product owners, product management, but there are other components in there because they all have a point of view. Finding someone or some group of people to act as that transmission is critically important. Someone with that can take that long-term planning horizon, pass information up, that short-term planning horizon, deal with it, sync it to the overall strategy, and then pass information both ways. That transmission is really important in terms of making prioritization happen well. You know, as I said, I think prioritization happens a lot at the lower levels of the organization. It happens far less frequently at the top of the house and, somewhere in between in the middle. We couple that with things like jumping the queue and 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 people adding things to the list. Oh no, it's really urgent. My hair's on fire. Help, help. I mean, you stop, stop. It just goes crazy and it drives people crazy. And I don't mean that in a medical sense, but it's frustration. It makes people frustrated with how work is being done. I Maybe I'm a little bit obsessive, but I like to get things done. I focus on getting a couple of things done every day. That doesn't mean I'm not picking things up. It's not doesn't mean that occasionally I don't hop over to my phone and play Pokemon Go and do things like that. But the idea that someone is going to change my direction every day makes me crazy. And that builds a level of antipathy, and fatigue builds up. There is all sorts of research that tells us that people that are happy with what they're doing, if they're focused on something that's important, makes them more engaged. More engaged people tend to do a lot better work. Again, this fatigue thing is a real issue. It's not something that any of us probably haven't looked at. We haven't seen. It's important. That again, that whole idea of, especially at the team level, the team isn't going to be able to control that very well. They can probably, if they're using any agile technique, reflect some of that back, but that ends up being a leadership issue. It really becomes and flops really into the lap of this idea of the mushy middle. That whole transmission thing has to occur. Somebody needs to dampen the amount of change down so people can actually check things off their list, get things done so they can feel like they accomplished something. I'm rereading Jim Benson's why control whip, and very frankly, it really does boil down. People want to get things done. If they can't, they get frustrated, and when they get frustrated, they tend to take on way too much work, and which causes them not to get anything done to be even more long term, different sorts of long term, short term, those sort of mismatches. Short, too short of a planning horizon causes problems too, right? Um, if have you ever thrown two rocks into a pond? Just pick up two rocks with your hand. If you haven't, I suggest this as a pretty cool little exercise. You also find out which one your dominant arm really is. But pick up two rocks and throw them into a pond. you know, Not exactly, just as close to the same time as possible. A rock goes into a pond, you get those wonderful ripples. If it's a nice, non-windy day, I live very near Lake Erie. It is almost never not windy, but if it was, you could throw a rock in there and the ripples would go on. It would be very pleasant. It would be almost transcendent. You throw two of them together, they ripple out and they're pretty, and then they crash into each other. And that goes from pretty and geometric to chaotic when they interact. Obviously, it probably isn't true chaos. There's probably math for that. Um, I don't have that math close at hand, but again, it's messy. It creates fiction. Things crash into each other. One of the bad outcomes from prioritization with too short of planning horizons, it's very much like we're starting and stopping again, is that you know people deal with that in different ways. They can shut down, they can turn over. Again, this is where I suggest that if you're in an organization that doesn't, that reprioritizes too often. And again, I'm not talking about the reprioritization that goes on in daily planning. I'm not talking about the reprioritization that happens if you're using Scrum, let's say at the beginning of a sprint. I'm not talking about, the reprioritization, but if work is coming in an uncontrolled manner, you're probably reprioritizing much, in a much shorter time frame without formal approach. Um, some mechanism for synchronization has to occur, and that boils down to having, you know, leaning on the middle management parts of the organization. One of the classic problems, right, in terms of organizations that transform to agile is that they don't know what to do with the whole idea of middle management. And maybe most organizations have way too much overhead in terms of middle management, but you need somebody there. You need some group of people that are having those conversations and making sure that teams aren't thrashing. So the next category after we deal with timing, and if you have other ideas in terms of other timing problems that cause priority problems or prioritization problems, I'd love to hear that. So either in the chat or afterwards, feel free to reach out. This is, I think, evolving, and it's not something that gets talked about a lot in terms of, you know doing the day-to-day work at the team level, or heck, even in the middle management level. Agile tends to avoid these kinds of conversation, and other straight line, more more classic approaches tend to, tend to leverage it way too much. So there's some middle ground that we have to find here. But this next category, I think, is the hidden problem. And this is risk tolerance mismatches. This category really focuses on both organizations and teams and how they balance their exposure of having people and resources in the wrong place, accepting the wrong work, and then failing to meet expectations. It's funny. Earlier in my career, I did some work in Florida for the United Launch Alliance, just a little bit. And that was, that organization launches satellites. It's a public-private consortium that launches a lot of satellites. NASA is involved. It is very risk adverse. A lot of times they're shooting people up. I hope they're risk adverse. I'm old enough to have been in a workplace when one of the shuttles blew up. So and spending a day sort of depressed over that. Been a much longer depression if I knew anybody that was actually involved. But that whole idea. But we now have people like SpaceX and Blue Origin, and their risk tolerance is far different, right? So if they tried to work together, somebody would have to sort out these different risk tolerances. It really does boil down to, if you have bad risk tolerance or mismatches on risk tolerance, that you're going to fail to meet at least somebody's expectation. Every organization, perhaps even every sub-organization within an organization, has a different risk profile. I am a risk taker, and I tell people I work with, I'm happy to take a risk. What the heck? I'm a consultant. What's the worst that could happen? I go away, right? My goal is to take those risks for them, to go out and do that. But that doesn't have to be everybody else's. When you have two different risk tolerances that aren't normalized by some mechanism, you end up with stress, and stress and friction and all that have bad consequences. So let's start with people. This is sort of a fun one. I mentioned Goldilocks and the Three Bears earlier. So I hope most of you remember Goldilocks and the Three Bears, or at least have heard of it. If not, have fun Googling it or reading that fairy tale. It's at least fun. I've told it to my grandkids multiple times. Sometimes I embroider it just a little bit. But the Papa Bear, right? The Papa Bear, when Goldilocks is in, looking at his bed and his food, it was way too hot, way too hard, all of that kinds of stuff. That's sort of like having way too many people, way too many of the wrong people when you're going through the prioritization problems. Mama Bear, it was way too soft, way too cold, that kind of stuff. And that's, in my mind, that's like having too few of the right people. And then there's Baby Bear, and everything was just right for Goldilocks at that point. So we're shooting for a relatively fine line. That's why you have to go through the process of understanding who is involved in terms of prioritization and what their biases are. So the real problem, I think, with the wrong people boils down to an overweighting bias, overweighting of one thing or another. For example, if you were doing a piece of work for the core lending systems of a Wall Street bank, and it was being prioritized. It would make sense to have some stakeholders that were interested in cutting in cutting edge technologies, cutting edge ideas, but not a preponderance, right? Because that's the core technology. The same thing would not be true if you were doing prioritization for a fintech startup. There you would want the preponderance, but you would want to have somebody who had that core understanding of lending and things like that also there to add some different perspectives. We want to have different perspectives. We love diversity of thought, but we have to make sure that it's balanced one way or other, or we end up with an overweighting bias. So obviously, the solution boils down to mapping, going through a strong work, especially at that strategic level and at that middle level, and understanding what people's biases are and ensuring that you have the right balance. Again, that's blocking and tackling kinds of thing. But this isn't just a people problem, right? It a lot of it can be, but the next one in this category is I like to call this sort of the ostrich effect. So for those of you who've never seen an ostrich, or at least heard that ostriches put their head in the sand and to in essence hide, um, let's at least accept that that's at least metaphorically true. Ignoring risk boils down to well, that's just silly. Let's call it that. But one of the common causes for ignoring risk, and especially after something gets started, is the lack of psychological safety. Um, I saw a wild scenario relatively recently where a group of people had gotten together and they were doing a basically a review of a piece of work. After a couple of sprints, they were doing a more in-depth review, and a sort of an ancillary stakeholder started pointing out a couple of potential risks that they saw coming up. And very frankly, it was just bullying, right? The primary stakeholder who had the primary part of the budget basically laid into them in the middle of this meeting, forcing them to, in essence, back down. That risk wasn't raised until later. Very frankly, the project ended up going over budget. It was a project, and over time, and a lot of technical debt. Part of it was implemented, but part of it was just sort of sprayed all over the floor and never was done. Um, the risks that had been originally pointed out by those ancillary stakeholders reached out and sort of ripped off the heads of those people. Right? It was very very ugly. Pretending risk doesn't exist ends up with the wrong work getting done at the wrong time. Getting risks of all types into the open is really critical important. Um, again, I have seen a lot of work that really should be addressed with that kind of risk. Roam them, right? Going back to that old trope of roaming your risks, but do it publicly. Do it publicly, because very frankly, doing it in public, hopefully, right, if you have decent facilitation, makes it much harder to bully. In that case, it wouldn't have, because that person just that was accepted behavior. Um, yeah, they actually have a meeting called the grilling meeting, where they work over people in public. So it wouldn't have worked there, perhaps, but in many circumstances, doing things in public, getting it to be transparent, is a way of understanding what the risks are, kind of thing. And then roam them, right? In a similar vein. the whole idea of ignoring cutoffs. So as work moves forward, doesn't mean risks go away. Even if you're remediating stuff, you're mitigating it, you own it, you've decided to accept it, regardless of whether or not you've roamed that stuff. Risk tolerance, risk changes, right? The whole world changes. We're dealing with a world that evolves very quickly. You don't need to look further than the headlines of the news on a daily basis to know that it evolves fast, right? Work is rarely killed once it begins. I mean, this has been a classic trope even as far back as I can remember. So when I had not light hair and had dark hair and was just entering the workplace, writing my first line of COBOL code, that kind of stuff, the problem was no, once something got started, it had a life of its own. People talked about the whole idea of sunk costs and all that kind of stuff. The problem is that a lot of times this is a risk issue that we, in essence, we build up risk and we don't deal with it. Again, I've seen very few pieces of work that have ever been killed due to cost and schedule, but I have seen them when it comes to risk, which is probably the precursor to all of those kinds of things. I very rarely have seen that. Well, a matter of fact, so rarely that I've only heard of that actually happening, sort of like an urban myth, but never have I really seen that, right? So, formally reassessing risk at times gets you past that whole sunk cost, sunk risk kind of scenario. I like adding it, and I have done this when using Scrum. I've added it occasionally, a risk reassessment as part of the sprint review, right? Because we have our stakeholders there, we've shown them good things, they're in a happy mood, and it's a mechanism to actually have that conversation and make sure that we're keeping things on the list. By the way, adding those as in any of the agile techniques, adding risks as stories so that when you're going through planning, when you're going through refinement, those sorts of steps, you actually work through those and make sure that they're not gaining in steam or not. But again, this is having a risk tolerance profile. And when risk gets too high, if you can't remediate it, you can't mitigate it, you can't accept it, you have to pull the plug. Risk is risk is almost always sort of a precursor to something else. So when budget goes bad or when the delivery date starts to slip, there were probably there were probably indicators as risks earlier on. Pay attention to risk. So the next category in our march through how prioritization goes bad is prioritization outside of your span of control. Um, you know, it is the whole, this is one where I think one of the ways I know that something like this is going on in an organization is when that whole trope of I'm just going to do something and ask for forgiveness later is a common mantra in an organization. I'm not supposed to be doing this work. I'm going to jump the queue and boom. So this whole idea of prioritization outside your span of control again isn't esoteric. But let's start with when bottom up kind of prioritization goes bad and how that impacts things. Yeah, decisions where we human beings are decision making machines. Even the most timid of us make decisions all the time, And some of those are truly, well, all of them are outside probably, or a large number are outside any sort of formal prioritization process. Stefan Notenberg, in his great book Monotasking, Stefan has written two books that I've read, one on Pomodoro, the other one on monotasking. Both of them have changed my life, so I actually really highly recommend this. But in monotasking, he suggests that every person, every time they start a piece of work, and we'll go into the whole theory there, ask themselves, what is the most important thing I should be working on? That's a decision nexus, right? We're making that kind of a decision hundreds of times a day. When I type something, typing a piece of code or typing, a slide, what is the next thing what is the most important thing I should be doing next is the question that I run through my mind. Many of these decisions, if they're outside of my span of control, will have a ripple effect. Again, throwing the rocks into that pond kind of thing, and it goes crazy, right? So as we're working up and making these kinds of things, we're affecting the organization potentially. I, I, in real life, right? In real life, I saw a credit card processor lose an RFP because, well, heck, I was there. We weren't able to actually demonstrate that a feature was in production for for the RFP, walkthrough with the people that we were making the bid to. And very frankly, it was supposed to be there. It was, lo and behold, somebody had decided, hey, in my mind, the thing I'm going to work on is this over here, not what was next on the prioritization list. Somebody had made a bad choice. Yeah. Sequencing and prioritization have an impact. We ended up actually having to actually cut some people because of that. Not because, well, we lost the RFP, we needed the cash. It was one of those times in the world, right? So all work needs to be focused on a goal. Having, it's a sprint goal in Scrum or a goal for the organization, having, again, remember, strategic, mushy middle, tactical, linking all of those kinds of things together makes that question that Stefan asks us to think about, what's the most important thing, important, because it gives us an idea to, okay, is that truly most important to get to that? Is it? We can continually go down that path so that it can be an effect, so that we as decision machines can be really effective at doing that, right? It's again important, especially because bottom up prioritization is going to happen individual and team level all the time. So we have to have some way of knowing where we're going. Obviously, if bottom up prioritization can go awry, so can top down prioritization. And to an extent, arguably, this whole idea of micromanagement, by the way, it's a really bad idea. Please don't do it. Is really an effective means of prioritization. It's effective because somebody is effectively prioritized. Is it good? Does it have the right impact? Does it have the right outcomes? Probably not. But, you know, they're marching in that right order kind of thing. Uh, it's I've noted at the macro level that the three levels, right? In most organizations, strategic, tactical, mushy middle, each layer influences the other. But when another layer actually tells the layer either above or below them how to do their job, um, yeah, a storm can ensue. It is a really bad idea. Um, And very frankly, it impacts not only the outcome, but it impacts people. I have seen and managed people that had been micromanaged and had to help them learn, help them learn to get the, in terms of being able to make their own decisions. The whole idea of permissioning from Marquardt in Turn the Ship Around. Good idea, by the way. Great book, another great book to read. But again, when people are learning that, it can be a little bit painful, but very frankly, it ends up with a more flexible team. So very frankly, yeah, this is one where if you're prioritizing and telling people what to do purely from a top-down perspective, and it's truly micromanagement, you just got to stop that. That's not a place to be. And if you're doing it, get some help. Get some help. If you're getting impacted by it and can't affect it, get a new job. It's not worth it. Your life is, you spend a lot of time at work. You got to be able to like it. The third, sort of outside your span of control idea, this is the one. Micromanagement is really bad, but you can generally help people recognize that. Mr. Know-it-all. And I think probably all of us have run into a person that seems to know more, or at least thinks they know better than anybody else what to do, right? And they, when they're not committed to the current set of decisions, they can cause all sorts of trouble. And very frankly, they tend to hide it, right? They silently undercut those decisions, and they don't tell anybody. They might make their pitch early, but they go underground, and those decisions are only found when you expose them, and then they get vociferously defended, which again causes all sorts of problems. Peter Drucker suggested that you build into the decision the action to carry it out, or at least the first couple of actions to carry it out. That way, people tend to find it much more difficult to silently submarine it. Process problems. Process problems is the one of the categories that it's near. It really is all about how this happens, and I'm sure I could look around my office and point out a half a dozen process books that would talk about this. But interestingly, this is it just stays a problem, right? The process for prioritization and sequencing should have more in common with a well-oiled basketball team or a well-ordered, well-oiled, well-coached football team than a bunch of 5-year-olds playing soccer in the schoolyard or watching my second grade grandson play soccer. It's fun, but it's swarm ball is really a better answer for it, which is not what you want in terms of prioritization. What we're looking to do, right, in process problem is to avoid some of the negative biases that people have when they hear the word process by creating a framework for stuff to happen for action to happen within. I mean, even in the ubiquitous Scrum, right? That framework, it leverages processes to make stuff happen. So, if we say, oh, we don't want processes here, I mean, the process isn't the real culprit. Bad process is really the issue, not process per se. The first of the process problems is it's a lot like my golf swing. No follow through, right? It's you fire and forget. People prioritize, and then next time we reprioritize, and we don't get feedback. the lack of follow-up to determine the cost, whether or not we got what we thought we'd get out of that is it. It allows people to paint all sorts of stories. People want certain things, they want to do certain forms of work, and they are going to spin things the way they want to. And the only way to know, and help them learn is to actually measure the impact of every significant piece of work so that you know how to refine prioritization, so that you know how to refine your risk profile kind of thing. The second one in this category is sort of a random walk problem. And that's it's probably it is still a process, and it is still prioritization. I went One of the universities I went to is in Louisiana here in the States, and if you're not here in the States, Louisiana's weather, we always used to say, hey, if you don't like the weather, blink and it'll be different. It would go from torrential downpours to absolutely stone cold dry and clear almost instantaneously. The mosquitoes were always bad, the humidity was always bad, but in general, the weather changed a lot. Letting people have basically, you know, a set of rules that change at a moment's notice is a really bad way to prioritize. It creates all sorts of other kinds of frustrations. One time, I was a department manager at a major financial institution. It was a great job. I had great people. We did fun work, but the process for getting anything approved um, happened to, basically quarterly. And every time it was different. And they would change the rules in the middle of it. I had to actually have a financial analyst in my department that worked on prioritization. That was his whole job. And by the way, he was a great guy and drank great beer, but it was still, he couldn't code, he didn't deliver stuff. He just took care of all this prioritization stuff because it it wasn't easy, it wasn't transparent, and it just happened over and over. It boils down to transparency. You got to have one set of rules. You got to, as they evolve, you need to let people know that it's going to evolve. Final one, or very close to the final one in this category, is magical thinking. And I think we all can fall prey to magical thinking. Prioritization needs to account for differences in evaluation criteria, but it has to have some criteria. It can't be just hope and wish. A friend of mine uses the term hopium, and very frankly, just hoping isn't a way to prioritize. So break things into smaller pieces of work. Ensure that you have a process for doing it. Garbage in, garbage out. Again, very much like wishful thinking, people will spend a lot of time and effort in terms of prioritization. They might even have a decent process, but they will think about this and worse yet, right? They'll use all sorts of loose facts or different approaches, and then they'll believe it. And they again go back to this whole risk thing. They won't retest as they go along. Whole idea process is to keep people pointed in the same direction, to have the right conversations as things move along, to ensure that the right people are in the right place at the right time, and that you can synchronize between layers. Final category for when prioritization goes bad is, you know, no control over work entry. And I'm not going to belabor this one. If you have no control over work entry, prioritization boils down to whatever gets finished in whatever the order it gets finished is the priority. Simply put, it's what people do, it's what people get done. So if they deliver it, it must have been the priority because that's what they did, right? Work prioritization ends up, the prioritization sequencing without control over work entry boils down to, yeah, it just boils down to an accident to fix this, right? There were a number of different solutions, ideas for solutions. It's drawing a line in the sand. Prioritization and sequencing is drawing that line in the sand and then testing against it. Just like drawing a line in the sand, it doesn't mean that you can't erase it and draw it somewhere else, but you don't want to be erasing it and drawing it somewhere else every 15 seconds. We have to get the timing right. And that is really a function of matching the ideas of prioritization and sequencing at different layers with the overall risk profile of the teams, the departments in the middle, and the organization at top.
Tom, I thank you so much for presenting with us today.
Thank you.